The temperature had dropped to 48 below zero, and Sheriff Clem Pruitt was burning his own paperwork to stay warm. Not the old warrants, not the outdated circulars. He was feeding 5 years of signed documents into the small iron stove in the corner of his office, one handful at a time, watching the ink curl and blacken and disappear into heat that barely reached the far wall. His breath came out in clouds. His fingers had stopped feeling useful an hour ago. Outside, the town of Coldwater Crossing, Montana Territory was dying the way small things die in deep cold. Quietly, without drama, 1 degree at a time. The coal had run out 3 days before the blizzard arrived. The wood had run out the day after. Now the people of Coldwater Crossing were burning furniture, fence posts, floorboards pulled up from back rooms, anything that would catch and hold a flame long enough to matter. Families had pressed together in the saloon and in the church, and in the general store sharing body heat, the way animals do when the world turns against them. Children had stopped crying 2 days ago. That was the detail that frightened people most. When children stop crying in the cold, something has shifted. Something has moved past the place where comfort is still possible. 400 people lived in Coldwater Crossing. Every one of them was running out of time. And somewhere out in the Badlands, in a place Clem Pruitt had ridden through 5 years earlier and declared empty and worthless and dead, a young woman who held a death certificate bearing his own signature was warm. She had been warm all winter. She would be warm when the blizzard ended, and on the morning of January 14th, 1888, she would ride into town on a gray Mustang, leading 3 mules loaded with firewood and dried meat. And the first thing she would say to the man who had buried her on paper would not be what he expected. It would not be what any of them expected. But we are not there yet. Let me tell you about Nora Hale, because a woman like this deserves to be told about properly. And let me tell you about the place she came from and the choices that were made about her life before she was old enough to make them herself. The Hale family arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1880 with $2,800, 38 head of cattle, a wagon loaded with tools and seed, and the particular kind of hope that only survives in people who have never watched a Montana winter work. Nora was 16 years old that spring, the second of 4 children, the one her father called difficult, because she asked questions he could not answer, and spent more time looking at the land than looking at the work in front of her. Her father, Thomas Hale, was not a bad man. He was a man who believed that effort was the same thing as wisdom, and that the gap between those 2 qualities would not become clear to him until it was too late to matter. He had sold a 40-acre farm in Ohio to fund this venture. He had read the pamphlets from the Territorial Land Office. He had believed what he read. The first winter took 11 of the cattle. The second took 19 more. By the end of the third winter, Thomas Hale had 6 animals left, $180 a debt of $340 to the trading post in Coldwater Crossing, and a wife whose cough had settled into her chest with the permanence of something that intended to stay. The dreams he had brought from Ohio had not died in a single catastrophe. They had simply worn away the way a river stone wears away smoothly and without complaint, until one morning you hold it up and realize there is almost nothing left. By the spring of 1883, Thomas Hale had made a decision. He would not speak out loud, but had already made. He was going to Oregon. He had heard from a cousin that land in the Willamette Valley was still affordable, that the winters were mild, that a man with some experience and some remaining capital could still build something. The cousin was probably exaggerating. Thomas Hale did not have the energy left to consider that possibility. On the morning of April 3, 1883, The Hale family loaded what remained of their possessions onto a wagon. Nora watched her mother climb up onto the seat with the careful movements of someone who has learned to protect a specific place of pain. Her younger brother and sister were already on the wagon wrapped in the same wool blanket, their faces showing the practiced blankness of children who have learned that questions receive no useful answers. Her father looked at her the way men look at things they have already decided not to take with them. There was something in that look that was not cruelty exactly. It was something quieter than cruelty and harder to name. He told her they were going to the fort for supplies. He told her they would be back in a week. He told her to stay close to the cabin and not to wander. Nora Hale looked at the wagon. She looked at what was loaded on it, every tool, every remaining sack of seed, the iron pot her mother had carried from Ohio, the small wooden box where her father kept his papers. She understood. She waved anyway. She stood at the edge of the property they would never return to and waved at her family's backs until the wagon crested the ridge and dropped below it and was gone. Then she stood still for a long time with her hands still raised, looking at the empty ridgeline, listening to the sound of nothing where the wheels had been. She was 19 years old. She had 1 horse, 1 rifle, 3 days of food, and the badlands of eastern Montana stretching out in front of her like a question she had not asked. Here is where the story changes. Here is where Nora Hale becomes something different from what anyone in Coldwater Crossing would have predicted. 2 years before her family abandoned her in the summer of 1881, Nora had made a habit of slipping away from the failing ranch and walking east into the Badlands. Her father called this wandering. Her mother called it worrying. Nora called it looking, though she could not have said precisely what she was looking for. The Badlands east of Coldwater Crossing were not beautiful in any way that a painting could capture. They were a landscape of eroded clay spires and dry coulees and ridgelines that looked like the bones of something enormous had broken through the surface of the earth. The rock changed color through the day gray, in the morning pale gold at noon, something close to red in the late afternoon light. Nothing ranched there, nothing farmed there. The people of Coldwater Crossing passed through occasionally and came out relieved to be on flat ground again. But Nora had noticed something in the early mornings when the air was cold, and still enough that differences in temperature became visible. In certain places, thin ribbons of steam rose from cracks in the earth. Not smoke, not fire, something else. Something the ground was producing on its own, as if the land itself was breathing. She followed one of those ribbons of steam one morning in July of 1881, deeper into the Badlands than she had ever gone down through a narrow coulee, where the walls pressed close enough to touch on both sides, and into a small hidden valley where the ground was warm underfoot, and the air smelled of minerals and something ancient. That was where she found Ember Ridge Woman. The old woman was sitting outside a cave entrance, working on a strip of hide with a bone tool, and she looked up at Nora with the unhurried attention of someone who has seen many unexpected things and learned that most of them are harmless. She was Crow. She had lived in these Badlands for 50 years alone after refusing to go to the reservation when her people were pushed onto it. She was perhaps 70 years old. Her face held the particular expression of someone who has been waiting a long time and has become comfortable with the waiting. She looked at Nora for a long moment. Then she said in English that carried the texture of someone who had learned the language from the land itself, "You are not supposed to be here. But you are. So you might as well learn something." For 2 years, whenever she could slip away from the ranch, Nora came back to that valley. She learned 3 things from Ember Ridge Woman, and those 3 things would eventually save 47 lives. She learned where the geothermal vents released heat from deep in the earth, keeping pockets of the Badlands warm, even when the surface world froze. She learned where the cave systems went back into the hills, opening into chambers that maintained a temperature of 55 degrees through the coldest winters. She learned how to read the signs the ground gave, the specific quality of steam, the particular warmth underfoot, the way certain plants grew near vents that nothing else would touch. The earth remembers fire, Ember Ridge woman told her. Long ago, this land burned from below. The fire is still there, sleeping. If you know where to look, you can find its warmth. Nora did not know, in 1881, why this knowledge mattered. She filed it carefully in the part of her mind where useful things were kept next to her. Understanding of weather patterns and her ability to read animal sign. And she kept coming back because the old woman was interesting and the valley was warm. And the questions she could ask there were different from the questions she could ask anywhere else. When her family left her on April 3, 1883, Nora did not panic. She stood at the empty ridgeline for whatever time she needed to stand there. Then she turned east and rode into the Badlands. She found the cave system Ember Ridge woman had shown her. The main chamber was larger than she remembered, perhaps the size of a generous barn, with a ceiling that arched high enough to stand under, and a floor of packed earth that held the heat from the vent below. The temperature inside was 55 degrees. Outside, April nights in Montana territory could still reach 0. The difference between those two numbers was the difference between survival and its absence. Nora Hale picketed her horse at the cave entrance, carried her 3 days of food inside, sat down on the warm earth floor, and began thinking about what came next. 3 months later, Sheriff Clem Pruitt rode into the Badlands to find her body. Let me tell you about Clem Pruitt because the man deserves to be understood clearly before he becomes the story he eventually becomes. He was 44 years old in 1883. A broad man with a lawman's deliberate way of moving, the kind of walk that says, I am in no hurry because I have already decided where this is going. He had been sheriff of Coldwater Crossing for 9 years. He wore his silver star the way some men wear their success, not as a symbol of responsibility, but as evidence of arrival. He had not arrived from very far, but he had arrived further than most men in the territory thought he would. And that distinction mattered to him. He was not, by the definitions available in 1883, a corrupt man. He accepted small considerations from the saloon owners because everyone did, and because the line between a gift and a bribe is often drawn by whoever is doing the accepting. He looked the other way when the cattle barons pressured small homesteaders off marginal land, because the cattle barons represented the economic future of the territory. And Pruitt had learned to align himself with futures rather than with the people futures leave behind. He was a man of his place and time. That is perhaps the most accurate thing that can be said about him. When the Vance family posted a notice in the territorial newspaper about their daughter who had gone missing in the Badlands, Clem Pruitt was the logical person to investigate. The notice mentioned a small reward for anyone who found the girl or evidence of what had happened to her. The family wanted closure. They wanted paperwork. They wanted the kind of official document that would let them move forward without the weight of an open question. Pruitt rode out with 2 deputies on a Tuesday morning in July. They spent 3 days in the Badlands covering the terrain systematically, finding nothing of use. The Badlands were designed to keep their secrets. The coulees looked alike. The ridgelines offered no obvious trail. The cave systems went back further than any man on horseback was willing to follow, without more reason than a missing girl and a small reward. He found no body. He found no fire. He found no shelter. He found truthfully nothing at all. But here is what Pruitt understood that his deputies did not. and what the people of Coldwater Crossing would not know for 5 more years. Under the homestead laws of Montana Territory, abandoned land could be claimed after a qualifying period if the original claimant could be proven dead or absent without intention to return. Thomas Hale had filed a homestead claim on 160 acres before the family arrived. When the Hales left for Oregon, that claim became the legal equivalent of an open question, a property that existed in a kind of official limbo until someone clarified its status. If Thomas Hale returned, the claim was his. If Thomas Hale was declared to have abandoned it, the land would revert and could be reclaimed. And if the last remaining member of the Hale family who had been present in the territory was officially declared dead, the timeline for that reversion accelerated considerably. Pruitt had a brother-in-law named Wallace Fitch who was looking for land. At the town council meeting in July of 1883, Clem Pruitt stood at the front of the room and told the assembled citizens of Coldwater Crossing what he had found in the Badlands. No shelter, no water source, no fire. A girl alone out there in April, with 3 days of food and no knowledge of the terrain. He paused the way a man pauses when he wants the room to do the work for him. Then he said it was simple arithmetic. The girl was dead. He had found wolf sign near the eastern coulees. There was nothing left to bury. The case was closed. There was a murmur in the room. One woman near the back put her hand over her mouth. The council chairman nodded slowly. The nod of a man whose job is to confirm conclusions that have already been reached. Pruitt collected the reward from the newspaper fund the following morning. 3 weeks after the council meeting, Wallace Fitch rode to the territorial land office and filed a homestead claim on the 160 acres that had belonged to the Hale family. The paperwork was clean. The law was followed. Everything that happened was technically correct. This is how the worst things usually happen, not through fire and fury, through paperwork and patience and the quiet confidence of men who have learned that the law can be used like a tool, and that tools belong to the people who know how to hold them. Have you ever been in a room where the consensus was so complete, so certain, so obviously correct, that no one thought to question the man who had built it? Have you ever watched authority dress itself up as common sense and walk out the door before anyone thought to look twice? That is what happened in Coldwater Crossing on that July evening, and it would go unchallenged for 5 years. Nora Hale, if she had been there, would not have been surprised. She was not there. She was in the Badlands building something. The first months were the hardest, not because of physical privation, though there was plenty of that, but because of silence. The Badlands in the summer are not quiet in the way that emptiness is quiet. They have their own sounds wind through the coulees, the distant crack of cooling rock in the evening, the particular note that certain vents make when the pressure inside them shifts. But those are sounds without human frequency in them, and the absence of human sound pressed on Nora in ways she had not anticipated. She had been raised in a household of 5. She had never been alone for more than an afternoon. Now she was alone for days that became weeks, and the only measure of time that mattered was whether the sun was up or down, and whether she had enough water and enough food and enough warmth to see the next morning. She did what she had always done when her mind ran ahead of what was useful. She worked. She expanded the main cave chamber, using a steel pry bar she had brought from the ranch to work at the back wall, following the seam of softer rock toward the deeper warmth. She built a small stone wall at the cave entrance to break the wind without blocking the air. She dug a root cellar in the floor of a side chamber where the temperature stayed cool, but not freezing. She cut deadwood from the coulee bottoms, not because she needed fire for warmth, but because fire meant light, and light meant the ability to work through the dark months. And the ability to work was the thing that kept the silence from becoming something she could not manage. She went to Ember Ridge Woman in August with 3 rabbit pelts and a question about which plants near the vents could be used for food through the winter. The old woman looked at the pelts, looked at Nora, and made the expression that substitutes for a smile in faces that have mostly stopped bothering with them. Then she answered the question. In the fall of 1883, Nora Hale rode north to a crow camp she had heard about from Ember Ridge Woman and arrived with her remaining rabbit pelts and 3 deer hides she had spent 2 weeks preparing. She came away with 4 goats, a quantity of dried corn, and a relationship with the family who had traded with her that would prove useful in ways she could not yet predict. She also began that fall to observe. Every 2 or 3 weeks, she would ride to a specific ridge about 4 miles from Coldwater Crossing, from which the town was visible in the middle distance, too far to identify faces close enough to see patterns. She watched the way the cattle drives moved through which direction, which season, which buyers. She watched the railroad survey crew arrive in 1884 and begin marking the route that would bring the line through town the following year. She watched which buildings went up and which ones didn't. She watched the sheriff's movements, his patterns, his associations. She was not planning revenge. She was not in any conscious sense building a case. She was doing what Ember Ridge Woman had taught her through example rather than instruction, which was that knowledge of the land and knowledge of the people on it were the same category of thing, and that both required patient, consistent attention, and that the information collected in the observing years was the capital that got spent in the difficult years. She watched and she remembered, and she kept her own counsel. And the town of Coldwater Crossing went about its business below her ridgeline, with no idea that the girl Clem Pruitt had buried on paper was sitting her horse in the thin September light and learning everything there was to learn about the place that had decided to forget her. And in the spring of 1884, something happened that changed the terms of everything that came after. Nora rode to Fort Benton. It was a 3-day ride each way through terrain that required careful navigation and careful management of water. And she made it alone in the early spring before the trails became fully passable, because she had decided that there was one thing she needed to do before the next winter came, and the next winter would not wait for her to be ready. At Fort Benton, she found a land registry agent named Silas Drum, who operated out of a back office in the trading post there. He was a meticulous man in his 50s who had seen enough of the territory to be unsurprised by anything that came through his door. He looked at Nora Hale for a long moment when she told him what she wanted. She wanted to file a homestead claim on 280 acres in the Badlands east of Coldwater Crossing, including the cave system and the geothermal zone and the land surrounding them. Drum asked her if she had been resident on the land for the qualifying period. She told him she had been resident there since April of 1883. He asked her for her name. She gave it. He looked at her again with the particular attention of a man who is matching what he sees against something he knows. He did not ask her about the death certificate. He was a land registry agent, not a judge, and his job was to record claims made by people who were standing in front of him. And Nora Hale was standing in front of him, and she was clearly alive. He completed the paperwork in his careful hand and stamped it with the territorial seal, and handed her the copy, and kept the original in his files. The document bore the date of September 3rd, 1884. No one in Coldwater Crossing looked for land claims filed under the name of a dead girl. Nora Hale rode back to the Badlands with the paper folded inside her coat against her chest, in the place where people carry things they cannot afford to lose. She did not show it to anyone. She did not tell Ember Ridge Woman about it. She placed it in a leather pouch and wrapped the pouch in oilcloth and pushed it to the back of the deepest shelf in the root cellar, under 3 inches of clean, dry sand. Then she went back to work. The summer of 1884 was the summer she began to understand that what she had was not merely a hiding place. It was something else. The cave system was larger than she had initially mapped, with passages that went further back into the hillside than she had followed in the first year. She had been exploring cautiously, one section at a time, and in June of that year, she pushed through a passage that opened into something she had not expected. The second chamber was 3 times the size of the first. Its ceiling was high enough that she could not quite see the top of it in the lantern light. The floor was nearly flat, and from the far wall a shallow stream of geothermally warmed water ran across the rock and collected in a natural basin before disappearing into a crack in the floor. The water was warm to the touch. Not hot, but warm the way a hand is warm after it has been working. The temperature in the second chamber was higher than the first. Not by much, perhaps 5 degrees, but in the arithmetic of Montana winters, 5 degrees was not a small number. She stood in that second chamber for a long time, holding her lantern, feeling the warmth on her face, listening to the sound of the water moving across the rock. And she thought about 48 degrees below zero, which is what the temperature would reach in the worst of the winter months. And she thought about the difference between the air outside and the air here. And she did the arithmetic in her head the way a careful person does arithmetic without rushing. 93 degrees of difference between the world outside and this place. 93 degrees that she had not earned and had not built and had not purchased. 93 degrees that the earth had been storing since before any human being had set foot in this territory, that would still be here after every structure that Coldwater Crossing had ever built had collapsed and been covered and forgotten. She pressed both palms flat against the warm rock of the wall and held them there. Then she began planning for the winter she did not yet know was coming. If you are enjoying this story, leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from today. And if you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, if you have ever had to build something in the dark, while the people who wrote you off went about their business in the light, this story is for you. Let me continue. Through 1885 and 86, Nora Hale expanded what she had built into something that had no name in the territory, because nothing like it had been built there before. The cave system now included the 2 main chambers, 3 side passages, the root cellar, a small stable cut into a side coulee that could hold 6 animals, and a drying room where she processed meat and vegetables through the fall. She had 4 goats that gave reliable milk. She had a garden in a patch of ground warmed by a shallow vent where she grew potatoes and turnips, and some variety of squash that Ember Ridge woman had given her, and that grew with an enthusiasm she had not expected. She had a system of stored water in clay vessels filled from the warm stream, and the surface catchments she had dug in the spring enough to last through the frozen months. She had tools. She had 2 rifles. She had a working knowledge of every medicinal plant that grew within a 10-mile radius of the cave entrance, most of it learned from Ember Ridge woman, some of it discovered through her own experimentation. All of it recorded in a journal she kept in the same careful way. She kept everything with dates and quantities and observations about what worked and what did not. She had, in the language of a place and time that did not have the word for it, a homestead. A functioning, productive, self-sustaining homestead in the place that Clem Pruitt had called worthless and dead. The railroad arrived in Coldwater Crossing in 1885. And with it came money and people and the kind of confidence that a town develops when it believes its future is already determined. Pruitt's star got a little brighter that year. His associations with the cattle barons became more visible, more comfortable. He stood taller at the saloon bar. His brother-in-law, Wallace Fitch, sold the homestead claim on the Hale land to a speculator from Helena for $800 and used the money to buy into a freighting operation. None of this reached the Badlands. None of this touched the woman on the ridge who watched through a small brass telescope she had traded for with a Crow family recording in her journal. The patterns of a town that did not know she was alive. And in the fall of 1886, Ember Ridge Woman died. Nora found her in the small cave where the old woman had lived for 50 years, sitting against the back wall in the posture of someone who has finished what they came to do and is simply waiting for the logistics of departure to resolve themselves. She had been dead, perhaps a day. The cave was cool, but not cold. The warmth from the vent in the floor still working, as it had always worked, faithful to its nature. Nora sat with her for a long time. Then she did what needed to be done. She prepared the burial in the Crow tradition as best she understood it from the things Ember Ridge Woman had taught her on a ledge that looked east over the valley where the steam rose in the morning. She placed the woman's tools beside her, the bone needles, the hide-working implements, the small clay figures whose meaning Nora did not fully understand, but respected completely. She covered her with stones from the coulee bottom carried one at a time over the course of 2 days. Before she had done any of this, she had found beneath the old woman's sleeping robes a packet wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a book of sorts, though it had not been made in any way a bookbinder would recognize. It was sheets of cured hide, perhaps, 40 of them bound together with sinew along one edge. On each sheet were marks, not writing in any alphabet Nora could read, but a kind of mapping, a set of symbols and signs and spatial relationships that Nora had seen the old woman working on over the years, always putting it away when she noticed Nora watching. She spent 3 evenings with the packet before she understood what she was looking at. It was a map. Not of terrain exactly, though terrain was part of it. It was a map of the geothermal system, the entire network of vents and caves and underground water flows that ran through the Badlands for perhaps 20 miles in each direction. The old woman had been mapping it for 50 years, updating it, correcting it, adding observations about seasonal variation and the relationship between surface weather and underground temperature. It was the most complete record of the subsurface geology of that part of Montana Territory that existed anywhere. It was Nora understood slowly, in the particular way that understanding arrives when the thing being understood is larger than expected, the most valuable thing she owned. She carried it back to her cave and placed it with the homestead document in the root cellar, in the same oilcloth, in the same clean, dry sand. Then she went to stand at the cave entrance and look at the night sky for a while, at the particular brightness of winter stars over Montana, the way they seem closer there than they do anywhere else, as if the cold has clarified something in the atmosphere. She was 22 years old. She had been alone in the Badlands for 3 years. She had 160 acres of homesteaded land, a cave system large enough to shelter 50 people, a food supply that would last through any winter the territory could produce, and a map of the underground heat network that had kept her alive through it all. She also had no idea what she was going to do with any of it. That question would be answered for her, as certain questions are by the weather. The blizzard of January 1888 arrived without the kind of warning that would have allowed for preparation. The sky on January 11th changed color in the morning in a way that old-timers described afterward as the color iron turns just before it breaks. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. The wind came from the northwest at speeds that no one thought to measure, because everyone was already inside trying to survive the cold. By the morning of January 12th, Coldwater Crossing was buried. Nora, watching from the ridge, had seen weather build before. She had watched the clouds come over the Rockies and knew the difference between a storm that would pass and one that intended to stay. This one intended to stay. She rode back to the cave on January 10th before the storm fully arrived and spent the day checking her stores, checking her animals, reinforcing the entrance wall against wind. Then she waited and watched and thought. Down in Coldwater Crossing, the coal ran out on the 13th. The wood ran out on the 14th. Clem Pruitt burned his desk on the 15th. In the saloon and the church and the general store, children had stopped crying. Cattle had frozen where they stood. The temperature on the morning of January 14th was 48 below zero and still dropping. Nora had not ridden to the ridge that week. She did not need to. She knew what was happening. She had known what was happening from the moment she saw the storm build. She sat in the second chamber of her cave, the larger one, and she did what she had learned to do when a decision needed to be made. She thought through it carefully. All of it, the years of watching, the years of building the death certificate with its clean official signature, the homestead map in the root cellar, the old woman buried on the eastern ridge. She thought about the 47 families in Coldwater Crossing who had 3 days of food left and no way to make heat. She thought about the children who had stopped crying. Then she thought about what Ember Ridge woman had said to her once near the end, when Nora had asked her why she had stayed in the Badlands all those years alone instead of going back to her people. The old woman had looked at the fire for a long time before she answered. Then she said, "The earth shares its warmth with everyone who knows how to ask. We should do the same." Nora sat with that for a while. Then she stood up and began loading the mules. On the morning of January 14th, 1888, Nora Hale rode out of the Badlands before first light. She had been awake since the middle of the night, not from anxiety, but from the particular clarity that arrives when a decision has been fully made and the mind is free to focus entirely on execution. She had loaded the 3 mules the evening before, working by lantern light in the stable coulee, distributing the weight carefully across the pack frames. Firewood on the first mule, the densest and driest, she had split to a size that would catch fast in a cold stove. Dried meat and root vegetables on the second, enough to feed 50 people for 3 days. Blankets on the third, the extra ones she had accumulated over 5 years of trading wool and buffalo hide and 1 large elk skin she had tanned herself in the second winter. She checked the loads twice. She checked her rifle. She checked the sky. The stars were still out when she rode east, and the cold was the kind of cold that has weight to it, that presses against exposed skin with something that feels almost like intention. Her breath came out in clouds that froze before they dispersed. The gray Mustang moved with the careful deliberateness of an animal that understands terrain, placing each hoof with the attention that ice demands. The 3 mules followed in single file, their lead lines tied to each other and to her saddle horn, their breath making a small moving cloud behind her. She had ridden this route in every season for 5 years. She knew every coulee crossing, every ridge approach, every place where the ground shifted from solid to uncertain. In summer, she could make the ride in 2 hours. In the dark and the cold of January 14th, it took her 3.5. She came over the last ridge above Coldwater Crossing as the sky was beginning to pale in the east. That particular gray that precedes dawn in Montana, the color of old pewter. Below her, the town was still. Not the still of sleep, but the still of something that has used up its energy and is waiting for whatever comes next. No smoke from the chimneys. A few windows showed the thin orange light of candles or lanterns, but most of the buildings were dark. The cattle pens were empty. She could see even from this distance the dark shapes of animals that had frozen where they stood, scattered across the winter pastures like abandoned furniture. She sat her horse at the top of the ridge for a few minutes, looking down at the town that had decided she was dead. Then she rode down. She came into Coldwater Crossing from the north down the main wagon road, leading her 3 mules in a line behind her. The sound of the hooves on the frozen ground was the loudest sound in town. She rode at a walk deliberately, not from any desire for drama, but because the horses needed to be careful on the ice, and because she wanted whoever was watching to have time to understand what they were seeing before she had to explain it. Someone was watching from the window of the general store. Then someone from the church. Then a face appeared at the door of the saloon wrapped in so many blankets that the face was almost all that was visible. She rode straight down the center of Main Street, past the frozen cattle, past the boarded windows, past the silent houses. She stopped in front of the jail. The door opened. Clem Pruitt stood in the doorway looking like a man who has not slept in 4 days and has recently given up on the idea that sleep is something that happens to him anymore. He was wearing his coat and his hat and 2 blankets over everything, and his breath came out in a thick cloud that hung in the still air. He looked at the woman on the gray Mustang. He looked at the loaded mules. He looked at the woman again. She gave him time to look. "Sheriff," she said. Her voice carried in the frozen silence the way sounds carry when the cold has stripped everything else away. "I hear you are running low on firewood." He squinted at her. The light was still thin, and she was backlit against the pale sky, and he was a man who had not expected this morning to contain anything other than cold and diminishing options. He tried to place her. Something in the way she sat the horse. Something in the set of her shoulders. "Who are you?" he said. "Where did you come from?" She let a moment pass. The kind of moment that has weight in it. "My name is Hale," she said. "You signed my death certificate 5 years ago." She watched him work through it. Watched his face move through confusion into recognition, into something that had no clean name, some compound of disbelief and calculation, and the particular cold feeling that comes when a thing you buried comes back to stand in front of you in the morning light. "As you can see," she said, "the reports of my death were somewhat exaggerated." By the time she finished that sentence, there were a dozen people standing in the street behind her, wrapped in blankets and coats drawn by the sound of hoofs, and voices in a town that had been silent for 4 days. More came out of the saloon. A woman with 2 small children pressed against her came to the door of the house across the street. Nora did not look at the crowd. She looked at Pruitt. "I have firewood and food and a place where people can get warm," she said. "It is in the Badlands. I know the way. Anyone who can ride or walk can come." There was a silence in which the town of Coldwater Crossing made a collective decision, the way towns do not, through deliberation but through the simple physics of desperation and available options. 47 people followed her back into the Badlands that morning. Now let me pause here before we get to what happened inside that cave, because there is something important about those 5 years in the Badlands that deserves to be understood. The easy version of this story is that Nora Hale survived through luck and learned knowledge and came back a hero. That version is not wrong exactly, but it leaves out something essential. It leaves out 1884. The second winter was the one that almost ended everything. The first winter had been hard, in the way that new things are hard, demanding but navigable, frightening but containable. She had the cave, she had the goats, she had the root cellar and the lanterns and the journal and the endless project of building and improving and learning. The work kept the silence at a manageable distance. The warmth from the vent was reliable. She was 19 years old, and 19-year-olds have a relationship with hardship that is different from what it becomes later. The body is forgiving. The mind is elastic. She got through the first winter on a combination of preparation and the particular stubbornness that had always made her father call her difficult. The second winter arrived in October of 1884, with less negotiation than the first. A cold snap in the second week of October that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in a day and stayed there. November brought snow that accumulated faster than she had seen it accumulate before. By December, the world outside the cave entrance was a wall of white that she had to dig through every morning to check on the animals. Then, in the first week of January, the goats got sick. She did not know what it was. She knew from Ember Ridge Woman that goats were susceptible to certain respiratory infections in extreme cold, and she had taken precautions, extra bedding in the stable, careful management of draft supplemental feed. But something got into the herd anyway, and by the third day of January, 2 of the 4 animals were showing the signs she had been told to watch for. By the 5th day, all 4 were sick. On the morning of January 8th, she found the first one dead. She stood in the stable coolly, looking at the animal for a long time. Then she went back inside and checked the food stores with the specific attention of a person who is recalculating something they thought they had already calculated. The numbers were not good. She had planned her stores around 4 goats providing milk through the winter, which reduced her dependence on the dried meat and vegetable stores by roughly a third. Without the milk, the math shifted. She had approximately 60% of the food she needed to make it through to the spring thaw. She had firewood enough. She had water enough. But the food calculation, which she had been comfortable with before, was now a problem. By January 12th, all 4 goats were dead. She sat alone in the second chamber of the cave that night. The larger one, the one she had been so grateful to discover. The geothermal vent was working as it always worked. The temperature in the chamber was 54 degrees. Outside, the thermometer she had hung at the cave entrance read 55 below. The lantern was burning. Her journal was open in front of her to a page of calculations she had been making and remaking for 4 days. She was 20 years old. She had been alone in the Badlands for 20 months. She had 4 dead goats in the stable coulee, and 60% of the food she needed to reach spring, and a cave full of warmth that was keeping her alive while doing nothing to solve the problem in front of her. For the first time since her family had driven away over that Ohio ridge 2 springs ago, she did not know what to do next. Have you ever been in that place? Not the place of ordinary difficulty where the problem is hard, but the shape of it is clear, where you know what you need and you simply have to find a way to get it. I mean the other place. The place where you cannot see the shape of the problem clearly enough to know what solving it would even look like. Where the usual tools do not fit the usual way. Where you sit with your hands flat on a warm stone floor and count to yourself without meaning to, because counting is at least a form of order when everything else is gone uncertain. That is where Nora Hale was on the night of January 12, 1884. She pressed both palms against the warm rock of the floor and counted. She counted to 60. She counted to 100. She counted to 347 before she stopped. Not because she had arrived at any answer, but because her hands pressed against that warm stone were reminding her of something. The warmth was still there. She was still alive, and she had been in worse places than this, technically speaking, which was to say she had been standing at a ridgeline, watching her family drive away with nothing at all, and had survived that too. She went to bed. In the morning, she ate carefully in the proportions she had recalculated the previous night, and she went to clean out the stable coulee because the dead animals needed to be dealt with. Regardless of what else was happening, and practical work has a way of clarifying the mind that no amount of sitting and thinking can replicate. She was pulling debris from the back of the stable when the wall gave way. Not the whole wall. a section of it perhaps 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, where the rock face met the packed earth of the coulee side. It gave way inward not with a crash, but with a slow, grinding shift, the way walls move when they have been wanting to move for a long time, and something has finally given them permission. Cold air rushed in from the stable side. Warm air rushed out from the other. She stood very still. Then she picked up her lantern and bent down and pushed through the opening. The passage was low for the first 12 feet, requiring her to move on hands and knees, and then it opened into something that stopped her completely. The third chamber was the largest she had found. The ceiling arched high enough that her lantern light could not quite reach it. The floor was wide and nearly flat. Along the far wall, a ribbon of geothermally warmed water moved across the rock in a shallow channel perhaps 2 inches deep and 18 inches wide, collecting in a natural basin at one end before disappearing into a floor crack. The temperature was noticeably higher than in the second chamber. She could not measure it precisely, but it felt warmer by several degrees. And in January in Montana, several degrees is not a small number. She stood in the new chamber for a long time, holding her lantern, looking at the space around her. Then she did something she had not done in a long while. She laughed. Not from happiness exactly, though there was happiness in it. From the specific relief of a person who has been looking at a mathematics problem that does not work, and has just been handed a variable they had not known existed. The wall that collapsed had been holding her back from the largest, warmest, most useful part of what she owned. Her worst moment had opened her best room. She went back through the passage. She ate a full meal, a deliberate extravagance against the recalculated rations because some moments require acknowledgement. Then she began methodically to enlarge the passage. That experience, the winter of 1884, marked a change in how Nora Hale understood what she was doing in the Badlands. Before that winter, she had been surviving. After it, she was building. The distinction sounds small. It was not small. Surviving is responsive. It answers the demands of the present moment. It runs on adrenaline and improvisation and the basic animal need to continue. Building is something else. Building requires a relationship with time that survival does not have room for, a willingness to invest in futures that have not arrived yet, to do work today that will pay off in a season you have not reached. She went to Fort Benton in September of that year after the spring thaw had made the trails passable, and after she had thought carefully about what she was going to do when she got there. She rode for 3 days each way through terrain that required her full attention. She arrived at the trading post, looking like what she was, a young woman who had been living alone in the wilderness for over a year. And she walked to the back office and asked for the land registry agent. Silas Drum was a meticulous man who had processed enough claims to know when something unusual was standing in front of him. He looked at Nora Hale for a long moment when she told him what she wanted. He did not ask about death certificates or family histories, or the question of why a 19-year-old woman was filing a homestead claim on Badlands territory that everyone in the county had written off as worthless. His job was to record claims, and she was standing in front of him, and she was clearly alive. He filed the paperwork. He stamped the territorial seal. He handed her the copy. She folded it carefully and placed it inside her coat against her chest and rode back to the Badlands. No one in Coldwater Crossing looked for homestead claims filed under the name of a dead girl. Clem Pruitt had long since moved on to other business. Wallace Fitch had already sold the Hale family land claim and spent the money. The 160 acres near the old ranch were already in the hands of a Helena speculator, and nobody gave them a second thought. In the Badlands, 280 acres of geothermally active land now belonged legally to Nora Hale. She placed the document in the root cellar with the care that important things deserve, wrapped in oilcloth buried under 3 inches of clean, dry sand. Then she kept working. The years between 1884 and 1887 were the years of refinement. If the first 2 years had been about basic survival, and the discovery of the third chamber had opened the building years, then these middle years were about something harder to name. They were about mastery, about understanding not just how to use what she had, but what it was, why it worked, how deep the system went, what its limits were, and what its capacities were. Ember Ridge Woman's Map was the foundation of this understanding, and after the old woman died in 1886, and Nora inherited the hidebound collection of 50 years of observation, her understanding expanded in ways she had not anticipated. The map was not simply a record of what existed. It was a record of what changed. Ember Ridge Woman had been noting variations in temperature and water flow and steam output for 5 decades, recording how a hard winter on the surface affected the underground system, how drought years changed the water flows, how certain geological events she had observed sent changes rippling through the network weeks later. The map was a living document of a living system, and once Nora understood how to read it, she could see things about the Badlands that no one else in the territory could see. She spent the winter of 1886 mapping the sections she had not yet explored, using the Hyde book as a guide extending her knowledge of the system, until she had a complete picture of what she was dealing with. The network was larger than she had imagined. It ran perhaps 18 miles east to west and 12 miles north to south. A subsurface architecture of heat and water that had been present under the Badlands since before the territory had a name. The geothermal vent under her caves was one of perhaps 20 major vents in the system, each one connected to the same deep heat source, each one creating its own local zone of warmth at the surface. What she had was not a cave. What she had was a window into the oldest heating system on the continent. Through 1887, she watched the town below with increasing attention. The railroad had been operating for 2 years, and the cattle economy had stabilized, and Coldwater Crossing was, by the standards of the territory, prospering. But around its edges, the smaller operations were disappearing. 7 homestead farms within a 15-mile radius of town were foreclosed by the Territorial Bank. That year, their owners moving on to wherever people go, when the land has taken everything they brought to it. Pruitt stood at the edges of these proceedings with his silver star and his careful neutrality. The neutrality of a man who has learned that not choosing is itself a choice, and usually a profitable one. Nora recorded all of this in her journal. The dates, the names of the farms, the names of the people who had held them. She was not planning anything. She was doing what she had always done, watching, remembering, keeping the record. In October of 1887, she began adding to her stores at a rate that exceeded any reasonable calculation of her own needs. Extra firewood cut and stacked in the side coulee. Extra dried meat, 2 full deer and 3 elk processed and stored through November. Extra blankets traded for at the Crow Camp to the north. She could not have explained to anyone exactly why she was doing this, because the explanation would have required her to say that she had a feeling, and Nora Hale had not been in the habit of trusting feelings that could not be supported by numbers. But the feeling was there. Something in the way the fall had gone, the particular quality of the cold that arrived early in September. The patterns she had observed in the underground water temperatures as recorded in Ember Ridge Woman's notation system, which she had learned to continue. Something was building. She did not know its name yet. On January 11th, 1888, she stood at the cave entrance and watched the sky to the northwest change color in a way she had never seen it change color before. The light went out of it in a specific way, not the way light goes out at evening, but the way it goes out from something that has stopped being possible. The temperature dropped 20 degrees between the morning and noon. By late afternoon, it had dropped another 25. She went inside and checked every store she had. She reinforced the entrance wall. She brought the horse and the 2 remaining animals she had acquired since the goats into the stable coulee and added extra bedding. She checked the root cellar twice. Then she sat in the second chamber and waited for what was coming. On January the 12th and 13th, the blizzard came. She stayed inside working on the hide map, adding notations about what the underground temperature readings were telling her about the surface conditions. On the evening of the 13th, she climbed to a high point in the back passages that came nearest to the surface, where she had cut a small observation hole the previous spring and looked out across the Badlands toward Coldwater Crossing. The town was dark. No smoke. No movement. She sat there for a long time. Let me tell you what Nora Hale was thinking in those hours, because it matters to understand that her decision was not simple, and that understanding it simply does not do it justice. She had been declared dead by that town. Her family had been permitted to abandon her and disappear without consequence. Clem Pruitt had collected a reward for her death and used his official position to facilitate the theft of her family's land. And he had done this so cleanly and so legally that there was no mechanism in the territory that would have corrected it if she had simply ridden in and objected 5 years ago. The people of Coldwater Crossing had heard him declare her dead and had accepted it without question, because it was convenient and because a live girl in the Badlands was a problem and a dead girl was a closed case. She owed them nothing. She had built everything she had without any assistance from any of them. She had discovered and developed and mapped and improved a geological resource that no one else had known existed on land she now legally owned through 5 years of solitary labor and careful thought. Everything in those caves was hers, earned by the most basic of all claims, the claim of presence and work and time, and the families in those frozen houses below her. The children who had stopped crying, they had not been the ones who signed the death certificate. They had not been the ones who filed the land claim under a dead girl's name. They were people who had come to the territory with their own versions of hope and had done their best with what the territory gave them, which was sometimes very little and sometimes nothing at all. She thought about what Ember Ridgewoman had said. The earth shares its warmth with everyone who knows how to ask. We should do the same. She went back through the passage to the main chambers. She began checking the loads on the mules she had packed the evening before, adjusting the weight distribution, making sure the ropes were sound. Then she tried to sleep for a few hours because the morning was going to require everything she had. And a person who has learned to be practical about resources understands that the body is the most important one. At 4 in the morning on January 14th, she rose, ate a careful meal, checked the animals, checked the loads, checked the sky one final time. Then she rode out of the Badlands toward the town that had decided she was dead, leading 3 mules loaded with everything she could carry into the coldest morning that part of Montana territory had seen in living memory. The 47 people who followed her back through the Badlands that morning did not fully understand what they were following her to. They understood firewood and food and a place out of the wind. The rest of it, the scale of what she had built, the depth of the cave system, the warmth that met them at the entrance like a physical thing, like a hand pressed against a cold face. That part arrived as a series of small revelations as they moved deeper into the hill. The first revelation was the temperature. Even the entrance chamber, which was the coolest part of the system, was noticeably warmer than the outside air. By the time the last person was inside, children were already pulling off their outermost layers. The second revelation was the size. The main passage opened into the first chamber, and people spread into it, and it held them all without crowding. When Nora led them further back into the second chamber, and then into the large third chamber, there were murmurs that she heard, without entirely processing the sounds people make when something exceeds their capacity to have expected it. The third revelation was the water. The warm stream in the third chamber, moving in its shallow channel across the rock, available to anyone who wanted to fill a cup. Children crouched beside it and put their hands in and looked at each other, with expressions that combined disbelief and relief, in a way that Nora found difficult to watch without something happening in her chest that she did not have immediate use for. She kept moving. There was still work to do. The firewood needed to be stacked near the entrance for people to take home when the storm passed. The food needed to be organized by type and distributed fairly. The weakest people, the elderly, the very young, the ones who had been coldest the longest, needed to be placed nearest to the main vent where the warmth was most consistent. She gave orders with the easy directness of someone who has been in charge of her own survival for 5 years and knows that clarity is a form of kindness. People listened. They were cold and frightened and grateful, and gratitude makes people cooperative in ways that ordinary circumstances do not. Cord Pruitt was 8 years old, a serious-faced boy with his father's build already visible in the width of his shoulders, and he came in carrying his 3-year-old sister against his chest because his mother was too weakened to manage the walk. He set his sister down on a blanket near the vent, and then stood up and looked around the cave with the specific attention of a child who is storing something rather than simply observing it. He found Nora near the water channel, distributing clay cups from her shelf. "How does the ground stay warm?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said what Ember Ridge woman had said to her the first time she had asked a question in this valley. "The earth remembers fire," she said. "Long ago, this land burned from below. The fire is still there, sleeping. Your job is to find where it kept the memory." He looked at the water moving in its channel. He looked at the warm walls. He nodded slowly, the way children nod when they are committing something to a place where it will stay. Clem Pruitt had come in with the others. He had not come willingly exactly, but the alternative to coming was freezing in a jail, with the ashes of his paperwork for company. And even men like Pruitt retained the basic preference for their own continuation. He stood at the edge of the third chamber, apart from the others, watching Nora move through the crowd, checking on people, making decisions, distributing the resources she had spent 5 years accumulating. He had built nothing in those 5 years. He had maintained his position and his associations and his silver star and his brother-in-law's land transaction, and all of those things had led him here to the back of a cave in the Badlands alive, because the girl he had buried on paper had chosen to come back for him along with everyone else. He watched her for a long time. Then he moved through the crowd toward her, and she looked up before he reached her, the way people look up when they feel something coming. "I declared you dead," he said. "I know," she said. She did not stop what she was doing. She was checking the temperature of a child's hands, working the small fingers gently to assess the circulation. She looked at him once level, and without particular anger, the look of someone who has had 5 years to decide what this moment meant and has arrived at a conclusion that does not require his input. "You took the easy way out," she said. "You decided I was not worth the trouble of a real search. You wanted me to be dead, so you made it official." She returned her attention to the child, rubbed the small hands between hers, satisfied herself that the fingers were recovering. "But I am not dead, Sheriff," she said. "I am the only reason you are not freezing right now." He had nothing to say to that. What could he say? She was right, and they both knew it. And the particular quality of being wrong in a way that cannot be argued with is its own kind of cold one that no geothermal vent can touch. She moved on to the next person who needed her attention. Outside, 48 below zero. The blizzard pressing against the rock and the earth above their heads trying its best. Inside, 58 degrees. The warm stream moving in its channel. Children beginning to sleep. The oldest of the old-timers holding their hands near the vent and looking at each other with the expression of people who have just revised something fundamental about what they thought they knew. 12 days they would stay here. 12 days of a world turned upside down, of the dead woman who was more alive than any of them, of the empty, worthless Badlands that turned out to be the only reason 400 people still had a future. And somewhere in those 12 days, something was going to come out that would change the terms of everything that had happened since July of 1883. Something that had been sitting in the Territorial Land Office at Fort Benton for 4 years, waiting quietly in a file under a name that nobody had thought to look for. Because nobody looks for the records of the dead. They stayed 12 days. 12 days in which the world above them remained locked in the worst cold. That part of Montana Territory had recorded in living memory, and the world below in the chambers that Nora Hale had found and mapped and expanded through. 5 years of solitary work, stayed at a temperature that allowed people to remove their coats and remember what it felt like to have full use of their hands. In those 12 days, something happened that Nora had not anticipated, though perhaps she should have. Community formed. Not the polite, managed community of a town with a sheriff and a council, and the usual arrangements of social order, but something older and more basic. The community that emerges when a group of people have been frightened together and have survived together, and find themselves in a shared warmth they did not build, and could not have built alone. People talked, not in the guarded, strategic way of town life, where every conversation is also a negotiation and every piece of information has a potential cost. They talked the way people talk when the usual calculations have been stripped away by cold and fear and relief. They told each other what the last 4 days had been like in their houses. They told each other what they had burned and in what order. Several of the men cried quietly and without apparent embarrassment, in the way that men cry when they have been more frightened than they knew how to process. And the relief has come before they could finish processing the fear. Nora moved through it all, practical and attentive, managing the food distribution, and the water and the placement of people near the vents according to need. She was 24 years old, and she had been in charge of a homestead for 5 years. And she knew how to make decisions and communicate them clearly, and move on to the next thing without spending time on the drama of having made them. She also watched. She watched Clem Pruitt, who remained at the edge of things, never at the center. He ate what was offered. He helped when he was asked, moving firewood, carrying water, doing the physical work of a man who understands that labor is a form of currency when everything else has been withdrawn. He did not speak to Nora again after the first night, and she did not seek him out. What had been said between them in those first hours had been enough. The rest of it would wait for the appropriate setting. She watched Cord Pruitt, the 8-year-old, with his father's shoulders and his mother's patience. He had appointed himself a kind of assistant to Nora, appearing at her elbow whenever a task needed doing, carrying things, directing people, absorbing the details of the cave system, with an attention that was different from curiosity. It was the attention of someone who is learning rather than observing. There is a difference. Observers stay at a distance. Learners get close and ask questions, and do not pretend they already know the answers. He came to her on the third day with Ember Ridge Woman's hidebound map in his hands. He had found it on the shelf where Nora kept it between the clay jars of medicinal herbs. He held it with appropriate care, the care of someone who can tell, without being told that a thing is important. "What are these marks?" he asked. She took the map from him and opened it to the section that covered their immediate area and showed him how to read it. Not the whole system that would take more than 3 days, but the principles. The way the symbol for water flow related to the symbol for temperature. The way the spacing of the marks indicated depth. The way the whole thing was a kind of language once you understood its grammar. He listened with complete attention. He asked 3 questions, each one more precise than the last, each one demonstrating that he had fully understood the previous answer before moving to the next. Then he went to the water channel and crouched beside it and looked at it with new eyes. "The earth remembers fire," he said to himself. Not to her the way a person repeats something they are committing to memory. She left him there. On the 6th day, the storm broke enough for several of the stronger men to make the ride back to Coldwater Crossing to check on the buildings and the remaining livestock, and to bring back additional supplies from whatever stores had not been consumed. They came back that evening with the report that most of the buildings had held that 3 cattle had survived in the most sheltered pen, that the coal merchant had received a delivery from the railroad stockpile that would be available when people returned, and that the temperature outside was still 20 below, but dropping more slowly now, the back of the storm having passed. They also brought back news that Nora had not known, because she had been inside for 12 days with no access to the information that moved through town. 3 more homestead farms in the county had been foreclosed by the Territorial Bank in November, just before the blizzard. 40 acres on the North Fork of the Yellowstone, 60 acres near the Sandstone Creek drainage, and 120 acres directly adjacent to Coldwater Crossing that had belonged to a family named Aldrich for 11 years before the bank took it. Pruitt had signed the foreclosure notices. His brother-in-law, Wallace Fitch, was reportedly in conversation with the bank about acquiring the Aldrich property. Nora listened to this without visible reaction. She was thinking about a town hall meeting that was going to happen when the blizzard was over, and what she needed to have ready for it. On the morning of the 8th day, she went to the root cellar. She moved 3 inches of clean, dry sand from the back corner of the lowest shelf. She unwrapped the oilcloth. She took out the 2 documents that had been resting there since September of 1884, unread by anyone but her. The first was the homestead claim for 280 acres in the Badlands, signed by Nora Hale, witnessed and stamped by Silas Drum at Fort Benton, dated September 3, 1884. The second was a letter she had written to herself in the fall of 1887, during the period when the feeling had been growing that something was coming, and she had been trying to decide what to do when it arrived. The letter was addressed to the Territorial Land Commission. It described the geothermal system, its extent and nature and utility, and it asserted the legal claim of Nora Hale to the land on which it existed. She had not yet sent it. She had been waiting until the right moment, understanding that timing was a form of evidence. She held the homestead document up in the lantern light and read it through. Silas Drum had done careful work. The legal description was precise. The territorial seal was clear. The date was unambiguous. 4 years this document had been waiting in the dark under the sand. She folded it back into the oilcloth and placed it inside her coat. On the morning of January the 26th, 12 days after she had ridden into Coldwater Crossing, Nora led the 47 residents back out of the Badlands. The temperature had risen to 5 below, which, in the context of the previous 2 weeks, felt almost mild. The sky was the particular hard blue of a winter that has spent its energy and is receding, and the snow on the ground caught the morning light and threw it back so bright that people squinted after 12 days in the warm dimness of the caves. They came out in a long line on horseback and on foot, carrying blankets and coats, and the remnants of the food Nora had distributed blinking in the February light. Several of them turned back to look at the cave entrance before the coulee walls hid it from view. The children stared longest. Coldwater Crossing was a different town from the one they had left. The snow was piled above the first-floor windows of every building on Main Street. 3 smaller structures had collapsed under the weight of it. The cattle losses were worse than the scouts had reported, perhaps 80% of the livestock in the county gone. The territorial newspaper, when it eventually published again 3 weeks later, would call the blizzard of January 1888 the deadliest winter event in the history of Montana Territory. Coldwater Crossing, with 0 deaths among its residents, would be the only town in the affected region to make that claim. The town hall meeting was held on February 9th, 18 days after the blizzard. It was the first official gathering of the Coldwater Crossing Town Council since December, and it was attended by every able-bodied adult in town, which meant the hall was fuller than it had been for any meeting in its history. People stood along the walls and out into the entrance, and some of them were in the street outside, listening through the open door despite the cold. The council chairman called the meeting to order and began with the formal business: the assessment of storm damage, the organization of recovery efforts, the communication to the territorial government, requesting emergency relief supplies. These matters were handled with the efficiency of people who have been frightened and are now doing the practical work of not being frightened again. Then the chairman said there was additional business to discuss, and the room changed texture. He was a careful man named Augustus Vane, 60 years old, white-haired, with the deliberate manner of someone who has learned through long experience that the way a thing is said is as important as the thing itself. He had been on the council for 15 years. He had been in the room in 1883 when Pruitt had announced that the Holt girl was dead. He had nodded along with everyone else. He had thought about that nod many times in the 12 days he had spent in Nora Hale's cave. He had done some research in the days since returning from the Badlands. He had found in the council's own property records a notation from July of 1883, recording that the homestead claim of Thomas Hale, 160 acres, had been officially vacated, following the death of the last known family member on the property as certified by the office of the county sheriff. He had also found in the correspondence files a copy of the letter that had accompanied Wallace Fitch's claim application 3 weeks later. The letter was from the sheriff's office. It confirmed the death certification and cleared the way for the new application. Augustus Vane placed both documents on the table in front of him. Then he placed a third document beside them. He had written to the Fort Benton Land Registry the week after returning from the caves, asking whether any claim had ever been filed on the Badlands territory east of Coldwater Crossing. The reply had come back in 4 days. Because Silas Drum was a meticulous man who kept excellent records and was still in his back office at the trading post, still stamping documents with the territorial seal. The reply confirmed that a homestead claim for 280 acres in the Badlands had been filed on September 3rd, 1884, by a claimant named Nora Hale. The claim was valid, properly witnessed, and had never been contested, because no one had ever thought to look for it. Augustus Vane read the relevant portions of these documents to the assembled citizens of Coldwater Crossing. The room was very quiet. Clem Pruitt was sitting in the 3rd row. He had known this meeting was coming in the way that a person who has been carrying something heavy knows, that eventually the weight will come due. He had been sheriff for 14 years. He understood the law. He understood what the documents on the table meant. He stood up before Vane finished reading. What he said cost him something. Anyone watching could see that. It was not a thing he had rehearsed or prepared, though. Perhaps he had tried to prepare it and found that preparation did not survive contact with the actual moment. He said that he had made a mistake in 1883, that he had declared Nora Hale dead, not because the evidence required it, but because it was convenient, and because he had known that a vacated homestead claim created an opportunity for his brother-in-law, and because the girl had been difficult, and her family had not been important, and the Badlands had not seemed worth a real search. He said he had been wrong. He said he had spent 12 days in a cave that a girl he had written off as dead had built through 5 years of solitary work, eating food she had stored and warming himself by heat. She had found, and that during those 12 days he had thought a great deal about the difference between the law and what the law is for. He reached up and unpinned the silver star from his coat. He set it on the table in front of Augustus Vane. The sound it made on the wood was small, but everyone in the room heard it. Then he sat down and looked at his hands. Nora was standing near the back of the room. She had come in after most of the others, not from any desire for drama, but because she had spent the morning in the Badlands, tending to things that needed tending to, and had arrived at the meeting late. She had heard Vane read the documents. She had watched Pruitt stand. The room turned to look at her. She walked to the front, not quickly, not slowly, with the same unhurried directness she brought to everything. People moved aside. She was wearing her working clothes, heavy wool worn at the elbows, practical boots. Her copper-colored hair was braided back. She looked like what she was, a woman who had been working since before sunrise and would be working again before the meeting ended, and who had agreed to come here today because certain things needed to be said in front of witnesses. She looked at the silver star on the table. She looked at Pruitt. "Keep it," she said. He looked up at her. "Keep it," she said again. "Wear it as long as you can stand to. And every time you look at it, I want you to remember what it felt like to be cold and wrong at the same time. Not cold in your body. Cold in the way you get when you realize that the story you told yourself about who you were and what you did was not the true story. That kind of cold does not come out in any cave I know of." She let that settle. Then she turned to face the room. She did not speak for a long moment. She looked at the assembled citizens of Coldwater Crossing, the people she had watched from the ridge for 5 years, the people whose patterns she had recorded in her journal, the families she had fed for 12 days, the children she had warmed. She had known most of their names before she rode into town. She had known which of them were struggling, and which were comfortable, and which ones lit their lamps earliest in the morning, and which ones let them burn latest at night. She knew them. They had not known she existed. "I did not come back to collect anything from this town," she said. "I want to say that clearly. I did not come back for an apology, though I have heard one today that I accept. I did not come back for the land my family lost, though the record now shows clearly enough what happened to it, and the council can address that matter according to whatever conscience this room still has. I came back because people were dying and I could help." She reached inside her coat and took out the oilcloth packet. She unfolded it and removed the homestead document and set it on the table beside the silver star. "The Badlands east of this town belong to me," she said. 280 acres legally claimed and recorded, signed by a territorial land agent, waiting in the files at Fort Benton since September of 1884. The cave system, the geothermal vents, the underground water, the warm chambers where your children slept last week, all of it is mine." She paused. "And none of you are welcome there by right," she said. "Only by invitation." Another pause. The room was so quiet that the sound of the winter wind against the hall windows was clearly audible. "You all have a stand-in invitation," she said. "The door is open. If you are cold and you need warmth, come. If you are hungry and I have food to share, come. This is not a condition of your good behavior or your gratitude. It is simply what the place is for. The earth shares its warmth with everyone who knows how to ask." I learned that from a woman wiser than anyone in this room, including me. She picked up the homestead document and folded it back into the oilcloth. "But I want you to understand something about what you have been living next to for 5 years without knowing it. The Badlands are not empty. They never were. The geology of this territory, the heat underneath it, the water inside it, the cave systems that run through it, that is a resource as real as any coal seam or water right or grazing acre in the county. I have spent 5 years learning it. I have a map of it that would take you a year to fully understand. And I intend to continue living there and working it for as long as I'm able." She looked at Pruitt one final time. He was looking at the star on the table. He did not pick it up. The meeting ended quietly, as such meetings do when the significant thing has already happened, and the remaining business is procedural. The council resolved to conduct a formal review of the Hale homestead claim and the circumstances of its original vacation. This review, conducted over the following month, resulted in a formal finding that the vacation had been improperly executed and that the land had been transferred to Wallace Fitch under false pretenses. Fitch had already sold the land to the Helena speculator, who had sold it again to the railroad, and the chain of title was complicated enough that the council's finding did not result in the land being returned to anyone named Hale. But the finding was entered in the permanent record. Clem Pruitt resigned the sheriff's position the following morning before the council could formally remove him. He did not leave Coldwater Crossing immediately. He stayed through the spring, living quietly, not at the center of things, doing small work for a few of the businesses in town. People treated him the way people treat someone whose specific failure has been publicly established with a kind of careful neutrality that is its own form of judgment. In the fall of 1888, he developed a cough that settled into his chest, the way his old authority had settled into his manner deeply, and without apparent intention to leave. The winter of that year was mild compared to the previous one, but Pruitt did not have the reserves left to meet even mild adversity. He died in November of 1888, 10 months after the blizzard from a respiratory illness that the doctor described as a consequence of prolonged cold exposure in a man whose constitution had been more damaged than he knew. He was buried in the Coldwater Crossing Cemetery on a Tuesday afternoon in early December. The attendance was modest. The headstone, paid for by the council from the administrative fund, listed his years of service and the dates of his birth and death. It did not mention the girl he had buried on paper. It did not mention the cave in the Badlands or the 47 people who had survived the worst blizzard in territorial history because of what she had built there. The stone said only what stones usually say about men like him: the dates and the title and the silence of omission. Nora Hale outlived him by 40 years. In the spring of 1889, she came into Coldwater Crossing for the first time voluntarily, by which she meant for a purpose other than emergency, and met with Augustus Vane at the council office. She proposed a formal arrangement by which the cave system would be made available as a public emergency shelter, with the understanding that she would maintain and manage it, that the town would contribute to the maintenance of the trail and the supply stores, and that her land title would be formally recognized by the county in exchange for these access arrangements. Vane agreed without hesitation. He was one of the few people in Coldwater Crossing who understood what the arrangement actually meant, which was not only that the town gained access to the best emergency shelter in the territory, but that Nora Hale had chosen to make this offer. rather than simply withdraw to the Badlands and let the town manage its own affairs, which was what she would have been entirely within her rights to do. The arrangement held for 39 years. In those years, the cave system was used 3 more times in emergency conditions, twice for blizzard shelter and once during a period of sustained drought, when the system's underground water became the primary water source for a significant portion of the county's remaining livestock. It was used regularly for non-emergency purposes as well by families who came out in the summer to see the geothermal features by children who wanted to press their hands against the warm walls and feel the Earth's old fire by the occasional scientist or surveyor who heard the stories and came to see for himself. Nora taught anyone who came and wanted to learn. She taught the geology of the geothermal system in the practical terms she had developed over decades of working with it. She taught the medicinal plants that Amber Ridge Woman had shown her and the ones she had identified herself. She taught the principles of cave maintenance and underground water management. She taught the map page by page to anyone who sat still long enough to learn it. She never charged for any of it. She did not think of knowledge as something that should cost the person who needed it. She also continued to build. The cave system she left behind at the end of her life was substantially different from the one she had found. New passages had been mapped and cleared. New chambers had been identified and made accessible. The natural water basin in the third chamber had been improved with stonework that directed the flow more usefully. A simple but effective system for storing and distributing food supplies had been installed in the root cellar, which had been expanded to 3 times its original size. The observation point at the highest accessible passage had been fitted with a proper lens that allowed a view of the surrounding territory in any direction. She had over 40 years turned a geological accident into a designed and functional place. This is what people do who have a long relationship with land that they own, not on paper alone, but in the deeper sense of understanding and responsibility. In 1896, a reporter from the territorial newspaper came to interview her for a feature about the blizzard of '88, which had passed its 8th anniversary and was becoming the kind of event that people told stories about. He was a young man from the East who had not been in the territory during the blizzard and who had the particular confidence of someone who knows a story is good before he has fully understood it. He asked her if she felt vindicated. She thought about that for a moment. "There is a word for what I feel," she said, "but vindicated is not quite it. Vindication implies that I was waiting for someone to acknowledge I was right. I was not waiting for that. I was building. Vindicated is what happens to you. Built is what you do. I prefer what I did." He wrote that down. She told him about Amber Ridge Woman then at length and with care, because the old woman had not been mentioned in any of the early accounts of the blizzard story, which tended to begin in January of '88 and omit everything that made January of '88 possible. She told him about the 2 years of learning the knowledge of the geothermal system, the hidebound map that was now one of the most detailed records of subsurface geology in the territory. She told him that everything she had built and everything she had known had come from that foundation, and that the foundation had been laid by a Crow woman who had chosen the Badlands over the reservation and had spent 50 years learning the land from the inside out. He wrote about that too. The article ran with the headline about Nora Hale and the blizzard, which is what sells newspapers, but the section about Amber Ridge Woman was longer than such sections usually are, and it reached enough readers to matter. Cord Pruitt read it in the fall of 1896. He was 16 years old. That fall long past the age of asking what the marks on a map meant. Now at the age of understanding what the marks implied about the systems they recorded. He had been coming to the cave regularly since the blizzard year first with his parents, and then alone as he got older. And Nora had been teaching him the map in the systematic way she taught everything, building from the known toward the unknown, always anchoring the new information in something already understood. He was, by 1896, the only person other than Nora who could read the full map. This was not an accident. She had recognized something in the boy that first night in the cave, the attention that was different from curiosity, the questions that went in the right direction, the specific patience of someone who is built for the long kind of work. She had been teaching him the way Ember Ridge Woman had taught her, not with formal instruction, but with invitation, an example, and the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from doing rather than watching. He studied geology at the University of Montana, starting in 1902. He wrote to Nora from Missoula that first winter a letter that described his coursework with the specific frustration of someone who already knows more about a subject than the introductory curriculum assumes. The professors were teaching general principles. He had been working with specific ones for 8 years. She wrote back that this was a common experience, that general knowledge and specific knowledge were not the same category, and that his advantage was not the general knowledge his professors had, but the specific knowledge he had earned in the caves, and that he should store the general knowledge carefully and trust the specific knowledge absolutely. He graduated in 1906. He worked for the Territorial Geological Survey for 4 years. Then he went back to the Badlands. He led the first formal scientific survey of the geothermal system in 1926. He was 46 years old by then, a man of considerable professional reputation, and the team he brought with him included 4 geologists and a cartographer, whose job was to translate Ember Ridge Woman's hidebound map into the official notation of the United States Geological Survey. Nora was 62 years old that spring. She walked the survey with Cord for the first 3 days, not because she needed to supervise him, but because she wanted to see it through his eyes. This thing she had lived inside for 43 years, now being seen by people who were seeing it for the first time. On the 3rd day, when the team had reached the 3rd chamber, and the cartographer was working on the water basin section of his survey, Cord Pruitt stopped beside Nora at the back wall where the warm stone met the high ceiling, in the way she had always found particular. He put his hand flat against the wall. "The earth remembers fire," he said. She put her hand beside his. "Your job is to find where it kept the memory," she said. They stood there for a moment, the way you stand when a circle closes. Then they went back to work. The chamber was formally named Hale's Hearth by the Geological Survey at Cord Pruitt's recommendation. He included in the survey report a section on the history of the site that began not with the blizzard of 1888, but with the spring of 1881, when a 17-year-old girl had followed a ribbon of steam into the Badlands and met an old woman who was still learning the land after 50 years. He also included a section on Ember Ridge Woman, drawn from Nora's accounts and from the hidebound map itself, which the Smithsonian Institution had expressed interest in acquiring for its natural history collection. Nora had agreed to donate it on the condition that the attribution be preserved, that the map be identified as the work of a Crow woman who had spent 50 years in the Badlands of Montana Territory and had passed her knowledge to a student who had passed it on again. The Smithsonian agreed. The map is there now in the climate-controlled storage of a building in Washington, D.C., attributed exactly as she asked. Nora Hale died in February of 1928. She was 64 years old. She died in the 3rd chamber of the cave she had lived in for 45 years. The large one, the one she had found through the collapsed wall, in the worst winter of her life. The geothermal vent was working as it always worked. The warm stream was moving in its shallow channel across the rock. The temperature in the chamber was 57 degrees. She had not been ill exactly. She had been in the way of people who have worked very hard for a very long time finished. There is a difference. Illness comes from outside. This came from inside the quiet conclusion of a machine that has run well and long and has now done what it came to do. Cord Pruitt was in Missoula when he received the message. He drove the full distance to the Badlands and arrived before anyone had moved her. He sat with her for a long time in the warm chamber, as she had once sat with Ember Ridge Woman in the small cave on the eastern slope. They buried her on the ridge beside Ember Ridge Woman, overlooking the valley where the steam still rose in the mornings. The headstone was granite cut by a man in Coldwater Crossing who had been born the year after the blizzard, and whose mother had spent 12 days in Nora's caves. He cut the letters carefully, taking his time understanding that some things deserve the attention they require. The stone said she found warmth where others saw nothing. In Coldwater Crossing, which had shortened itself to Crossing sometime in the years after Pruitt's resignation, when people had stopped wanting to say the full name that carried the association, they still tell the story. Not the way newspaper stories get told with a beginning and an end and a clean moral. The way real stories get told, which is in pieces over time, with different people, knowing different parts of it, and the full shape only becoming visible when enough pieces are laid beside each other. They tell it at the co-op and at the diner and at the grain elevator and at the bar that has been in the same building on Main Street since 1879. They tell it to people who come to see Hale's Hearth, which is a state park, now protected and preserved with walking trails and interpretive signs, and a visitor center where Cord Pruitt's translation of the Geological Survey is available in a waterproof binder for anyone who wants to read it. The cave system is still warm. The geothermal vent is still working, as it has worked for longer than there have been people in Montana to observe it, as it will work for longer than there will be people left to care about the distinction. The water still moves in its channel across the floor of the third chamber. Children still press their hands against the warm walls and feel the earth's old fire. The phrase they use in Crossing when someone writes off a person or a place too quickly, when someone makes the mistake of confusing what they cannot see. For what does not exist is this: do not make the marshal's mistake. It is a curious choice of words, since Pruitt was a sheriff and not a marshal, but titles change in the telling of things. And what matters is the meaning which everyone in Crossing understands. It means do not assume that worthless and empty are the same as worthless and empty. It means do not sign the death certificate before you have done the real search. It means do not confuse the convenient story with the true story, because the convenient story is always shorter, but the true story is always the one that lasts. Some of the people who visit Hale's Hearth, the ones who take the time to read Cord Pruitt's survey notes and the history section he wrote and the attribution on the geological map, leave flowers at the graves on the ridge above the cave entrance, not because they knew Nora or Ember Ridge Woman, because they recognize something in the shape of what happened there. The patient accumulation of knowledge in the dark years, the care taken with things that seem to everyone watching from the outside like nothing worth caring for. The decision on the coldest morning of the worst winter anyone could remember to ride toward the people who had abandoned her rather than away from them. The best revenge is not revenge. It is the life you build in the place they said was worthless. It is the warmth you offer to the people who declared you cold. It is the map you leave behind for the child who will spend the next 40 years learning to read it. It is, in the end, simply refusing to disappear. The earth remembers fire. Long ago, this land burned from below. The fire is still there, sleeping. If you know where to look, you can find its warmth. so should we. The third week of February 1887 began the way the preceding weeks had begun, with cold that did not apologize and roads that had not seen wagon traffic in 10 days. The ice on the main road through West Plains was the kind of ice that forms in layers, each freeze adding to the last, until the surface is not slippery so much as absolute a thing that has decided what it is and will not be argued with until the temperature decides otherwise. The valley lay under it the way valleys lie under hard winters, patient and reduced waiting. Ruth had not been to West Plains in 3 weeks. There was no need. Everything she required was in the cellar, or the cabin, or the small barn, where the 2 goats and the cow spent their days in the warmth of their own bodies. She had designed her winter around not needing things she did not have, which was a different kind of planning than most people practiced and a more reliable one. Sadie Cole had been with her for 3.5 months. She had become in that time a part of the rhythm of the place, in the way that useful people become part of a rhythm, not by forcing themselves into it, but by finding the shape of what is needed and filling it. She started the morning fire without being asked. She kept the ledger without being reminded. She understood by now the difference between the 2 ends of the cellar, the way you understand a place you have lived in long enough, not by thinking about it, but by the way your body adjusts its temperature expectations as you move from the door toward the stove. On the morning of the 22nd of February, Ruth came down the slope for the morning fire and found Sadie already there, crouched in front of the open stove door, feeding the fire with the deliberate patience of someone who has learned that a good fire is built slowly. The lamplight moved on the stone walls. The cellar smelled of hickory smoke and the faint sweetness of the apples. In the far corner, the last of the autumn harvest still sound, in their straw, still worth eating 2 weeks before March. Ruth stood in the entrance for a moment and watched Sadie work. The girl's hands were sure. She had learned the stove the way you learn an instrument, not all at once, but in accumulation each session, adding to the last, until the knowledge lived in the hands rather than the head. She did not look up when Ruth came in because the fire required her attention, and she had decided it required her attention, and that was enough. Ruth thought about Harlan Voss crouching beside the cook stove in the Carroll County farmhouse, showing her how to read the color of a fire before she was old enough to manage one herself. She thought about the particular quality of his attention when he was teaching her something, the way he never rushed, the way he let the thing itself do the teaching and positioned himself merely as the person who made sure you were looking at the right part of it. She thought she might be becoming that. She put water on for the morning porridge, and they worked side by side in the warm end of the cellar, the way they had worked every morning for 3 months. And neither of them talked much, because the morning was not a time for talking, and they both understood that. It was that afternoon that Helen Whitfield came down the road. Ruth heard her before she saw her, the sound of boots on the packed ice of the path, deliberate and careful. The sound of someone picking their way across ground that did not want to be crossed. She was in the cellar doing the afternoon inventory, checking the crock of sauerkraut and making notes in the ledger, when the oak door opened and the cold air moved through the space, and Helen Whitfield stood in the entrance. She was not wearing her good wool coat this time. She was wearing the heavy working coat she wore for outdoor chores, the one with the frayed cuffs that Dale had offered to replace twice, and she had declined both times because the coat still worked, and replacement was an expense. Her face was composed in the way it was always composed when she had decided something before she arrived somewhere. Ruth waited. Helen came down the steps. She looked at the shelves the way she had looked at them a year ago in February. The same careful inventory, the same open conclusions. But this time there was something else in the looking, a quality that Ruth recognized after a moment as hunger. Not dramatic hunger, not the hunger of someone who had not eaten, but the quieter hunger of someone who has been eating less than they should for longer than they want to admit. Dale had lost $80 of pork when the smokehouse roof came down in January. Ruth knew this because word traveled in the valley the way it always traveled, not as announcement, but as information moving from household to household, through the ordinary traffic of people who needed to know the practical conditions of their neighbors. She had heard about the smokehouse from the Pearson boy, who brought mail along the road twice a week, and she had noted it in the way she noted most things, without comment filed away against the possibility that it would become relevant. It had become relevant. Helen said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I would like you to answer it plainly." Ruth said she would. Helen said, "We are short of provisions." The smokehouse was what it was, and we had not put up as much in the root cellar as we should have, because Dale thought the arrangement this year was sufficient. And I thought so too, until it became clear that it was not. We have enough for the store inventory, which Dale will not touch because it is the store's. We have enough for ourselves if we are careful. But careful means lean, and lean for Dale at 52 means he is not working at the capacity he needs to be working. And February is not over, and March is going to be cold. She stopped. She looked at the shelves again. "I am not asking for charity," she said. "I will pay what you ask. I am asking whether you have enough to sell." Ruth looked at her shelves. She had planned for herself and for Sadie, and for the ordinary contingencies of a hard winter. The extra week of cold, the batch of something that did not keep as well as expected. She had planned with the margin that Harlan Voss had taught her to build into every plan. Because the plan you execute in a hard year is always the one that assumed things would be harder than they turned out to be. She had more than enough. She sold Helen 4 pounds of the smoked ham, a crock of sauerkraut, a dozen eggs, 2 pounds of butter wrapped in cloth, and a bag of potatoes that were as firm and white as the day they came out of the ground in October. She charged fair prices, the same prices that Dale charged at the store for equivalent goods when he had them, which seemed to Ruth the appropriate standard. She did not reduce the prices out of sentiment, and she did not raise them because the winter had made them valuable. She charged what things were worth. Helen paid without negotiating, which was its own kind of statement. Then she said, "There is something else." Ruth waited. "Dale has been talking about you," Helen said. "The way he talks about things he has decided about. But it is different now from how it was. The talking is different." She paused. "I think he would like to come and see it himself. I think he would like to understand how it works. I think he has been thinking about it for longer than he would admit to me, and probably longer than he would admit to himself." Ruth thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "He is welcome any time." Helen nodded. She picked up the paper-wrapped ham and the bag of potatoes, and Ruth carried the rest up the slope for her, and they stood at the top of the path in the cold afternoon light for a moment, before Helen turned toward the road. Then Helen said quietly, not quite to Ruth and not quite to herself, "Those beans last February. I have thought about those beans many times since then." Ruth did not say anything. She watched Helen make her way carefully along the ice of the path toward the road, the heavy coat and the frayed cuffs, and the careful, deliberate steps of a woman who had made a practical decision and was at peace with it. She went back down to the cellar and finished her inventory. 3 days later, on the 25th of February, Dale Whitfield came down the road. He came alone without Helen, which Ruth had not expected. He was wearing his good coat and his hat and his boots, and he came to the door of the Mercer farm and knocked on the cabin door. And when Ruth answered, he held his hat in his hands and said he had come to see the cellar, if she was willing to show him. She was willing. She led him down the slope to the oak door. She opened it and gestured for him to come in, and he came down the 2 stone steps and stood upright inside the entrance and looked. He was a large man, and the cellar made him look larger somehow, the way small spaces sometimes make large people look more themselves, rather than less. He stood with his hat still in his hands, and he looked at the shelves. The organized rows of crocks and jars, and wrapped meats and wooden boxes, the cabbages hanging from the joists, the systematic and deliberate arrangement of a winter's worth of food in a space that was doing exactly what the earth had always been capable of doing if anyone had thought to ask it properly. He looked for a long time. He did not say anything, which was unusual for Dale Whitfield, whose default relationship with silence was to fill it. Ruth let the silence stand. She had learned from Harlan Voss that there were moments when the thing you were showing someone needed time to settle, and that speaking into that time was a way of interfering with the settling. She stood near the stove and waited. Dale walked to the middle shelf and looked at the jars of pickled beans. He looked at the color. He reached out and did not quite touch the jar, his hand stopping an inch from the glass, and then he pulled it back. He walked to the smoked hams hanging in the cold corner near the door. He bent slightly to look at one of them, the way you look at something you are trying to evaluate honestly, rather than confirm what you already believe. Then he walked to the back wall to the stove, with its pipe running up through the limestone fissure, above the stone platform beneath it, the plank counter to the right. Ruth lit the stove because it was mid-morning, and she had planned to bake bread, and she saw no reason to delay it. She set the fire small and fed it carefully, and the draft caught immediately, pulling the smoke upward, through the pipe clean and without hesitation. Dale watched the smoke disappear into the fissure above. He was thinking about December of 1884, and the 3 men at his counter and the cloth moving back and forth over the pine. He was thinking about the particular quality of certainty he had felt in that moment. The comfortable certainty of a man whose understanding of practical things had been built over 20 years of watching what worked and what did not, and how that certainty had felt as solid and reliable as the counter under the cloth. He was thinking about how certainty feels before the evidence arrives, and how it feels after. Ruth opened the stove door and put 2 split lengths of hickory in, and the fire built itself steadily. The cooking end of the cellar began to warm. Behind them, the storage end, with its shelves of preserved food, remained exactly what it had always been. 2 rooms in one, Dale said. His voice was quiet, not the counter voice, not the explaining voice. The voice of a man who is catching up to something. Ruth looked at him. "The earth makes the cold room," she said. "I just make the warm one." Dale stood there in the warming back end of the cellar for a while longer. He looked at the shelves one more time. He looked at the pipe disappearing into the stone above. He put his hat back on his head carefully, taking a moment with the brim. Then he said, "I was wrong about the smoke." He said it the way a careful man says something he has been preparing to say plainly, and without decoration. The words set down like objects on a table. Ruth said yes. He said, "I was wrong about the heat and the food." Ruth said yes. He stood there for a moment more. Then he nodded once, a single slow nod. The kind that is not agreement with something said, but acknowledgement of something understood. He said, "I appreciate you showing me." Ruth said, "You are welcome any time." He went back up the slope and along the road to West Plains, and Ruth watched him go from the cellar door. And then she went back inside and finished building the fire for the morning bake. He did not come back that winter. But Helen told her in April, sitting on the slope above the cellar, in the weak spring sun, with tin cups of tea warming their hands, that Dale had written a letter to a supplier in St. Louis in March, a catalog order, a small cook stove, the kind designed for a confined space with short legs, and a compact firebox, the right dimensions for an underground room. He had also ordered additional stovepipe sections, the kind that could be fitted into a limestone fissure and sealed with clay. Helen said he is calling it a commercial cold room for the store inventory. He says the summer heat spoils the perishables he keeps in the back room, and that a properly cooled underground space would reduce his losses. Ruth looked out over the valley. The hills were greening from the bottom up the way Ozark hills green in April. The cedars dark and the hardwoods coming in pale and tentative, the creek showing silver in the low ground. She said that is a practical idea. Helen looked at her. There was something in the look that was not quite amusement and not quite apology, and was something that sits between those two things and is harder to name. He did not say where he got the idea. Helen said. Ruth drank her tea. Helen said, I told him he should say where he got the idea. He said everyone in the district already knew. Ruth thought about that. She thought about the 4 families who had dug cellar kitchens that spring, following her design quietly and without announcement, asking practical questions through intermediaries rather than coming to her directly, because coming to her directly would have required them to say something out loud that they were not ready to say. She thought about the way knowledge moves through a community that is too proud to admit it is learning in the same underground channels as water, finding its way through the limestone without leaving a visible trace on the surface. She thought about the beans in February, the color of July in a jar. She did not say anything more about Dale Whitfield. There was nothing to say that the spring had not already said. April moved into May, and May into the first warmth of a Missouri summer, and the valley came back to itself the way it always did after a hard winter, a little chastened, a little grateful, the farms going green and the gardens going in, and the smell of turned earth replacing the smell of cold that had been in everything for 5 months. Ruth planted the kitchen garden above the cellar and the field corn in the lower 40, and the kitchen herbs along the south-facing wall of the cabin. And she did these things with the same deliberate patience she brought to everything, one step following the next. The season's work done in the season's order. Sadie Cole went home to her family in May when the roads were clear and the Cole farm was going again. She went with the small ledger Ruth had given her, her 3 months of temperature notations and observations packed into a bundle with her other belongings. She had not said much about leaving because Sadie was not a person who said much about things that were complicated. But on the morning she left, she stood in the entrance of the cellar and pressed her palm against the stone wall of the storage end one more time. And she held it there for a moment in the cool and the dark. Then she walked up the slope and along the road home. Ruth watched her go and did not call after her because there was nothing to call that had not already been given. The years after 1887 moved, the way years move when the foundation is sound. One building on the next, each season's work adding to what the previous season had established. Ruth widened the cold zone of the cellar in 1889, adding 4 feet to the storage end and 3 new rows of shelving, the expansion paid for from the money she had saved by not buying provisions from Dale Whitfield for 5 winters. She acquired a second milking cow in 1890 and expanded the kitchen garden and planted the lower field corner in sorghum, which she processed at the mill in West Plains and sold at a price that reflected the quality of a crop grown on soil. She understood well and managed carefully. She was not a wealthy woman by the standards of the valley. She did not intend to be. Wealth in those terms required debt. And debt was something she had watched destroy practical people with good intentions. And she had decided early that the life she could build without it was more valuable than the life she might build with it and might lose. The farm produced what it produced, and she spent less than it produced, and the difference accumulated in the tin box on the kitchen shelf. No longer $11, but a sum that had grown with the same patient deliberateness that governed everything else she did. In the autumn of 1892, she made an offer on 20 additional acres of hill ground adjacent to her property, the land of a family that was moving to Kansas and needed a buyer. She paid in cash. She wrote the figure on the page of a new ledger and noted the date and the terms and the names of the parties the way Harlan Voss had always kept his accounts. Because accounts that are not written down are accounts that can be disputed. And Ruth did not intend to spend her later years disputing anything. Dale Whitfield died in the winter of 1894 of a lung ailment that had been working on him since the previous spring. He was 60 years old. The store passed to Helen, who ran it with a competence that surprised people who had not been paying attention to the fact that she had been running it in practical terms for 15 years. While Dale provided the public face of it, Helen reorganized the back room of the store into a properly cooled underground space the summer after Dale died, using a small cook stove and a clay-sealed stovepipe and the zone arrangement that Ruth had shown in the cellar on the Mercer property more than 8 years earlier. She did not call it a commercial cold room. She called it the cold cellar, which is what it was, and she mentioned to anyone who asked that the design came from the Mercer farm on the Hill Road. Because Helen Whitfield was a woman who believed that things deserved to be called by their proper names. The years continued. The valley changed around the farm, the way rural Missouri changed at the turn of the century, the old certainties, shifting the young people moving toward the towns. The patterns of farming adapting to the pressures of a market that was becoming larger and more indifferent to the individual farm and the individual farmer. Ruth watched these changes with the attention she brought to everything and made her adjustments with the same deliberate patience, her decisions guided not by what was fashionable or what the county extension agent recommended, or what Dale Whitfield's successor at the store suggested when he came by to sell things, but by what the ground beneath her feet could sustain, and what her own labor could manage, and what she could know with certainty versus what she was merely being told. She held the 60 acres without debt through the agricultural difficulties of the late 1890s that reduced several neighboring farms to tenancy. She held it because she had built the kind of operation that did not require a good year to survive, that could survive a bad year without selling anything that could not be replaced. And she had built it that way because Harlan Voss had taught her, before she was old enough to understand, that the most important decisions you make about a piece of ground are the decisions you make in the first years when the temptation is to expand faster than you can afford. And the consequences of that temptation are invisible until they are not. Sadie Cole came back in the autumn of 1897. She was 23 years old, the same age Ruth had been when Thomas died. And the $11 sat on the table, and she came back with a husband named Edward Mercer, who was no relation to Thomas, but who had met Sadie at a church social in West Plains and married her in the spring of that year. She came back because Edward was looking for a piece of ground to start on, and Sadie knew the Ozarks and knew what ground was worth working and what was not. And she had written to Ruth in the summer to ask whether the old Pearson 40 on the north side of the creek road was as good as she remembered it being. Ruth had written back that it was good ground, better than it looked, and that the Pearson family was interested in selling. Edward and Sadie Cole Mercer bought the Pearson 40 in the autumn of 1897 and broke their first ground that October. They were 23 years old, both of them, and they had $300 in savings and a piece of land and the winter ahead of them. Sadie dug the root cellar herself in November of that year, before the first hard frost, using a pick and a shovel in the north face of the low hill behind the farmhouse. She dug it to the dimensions she had learned at the Mercer farm a decade earlier, 8 feet wide and 12 feet deep. The door set into the south-facing slope with a drainage slope away from the threshold. She lined the walls with dry stacked stone from the creek bed and roofed it with split oak beams covered in packed earth. She installed the cook stove herself, moving the body on a hand truck down the slope from the house. The same problem Ruth had solved with the same tool 12 years before, the cast iron pieces carried one at a time and assembled in the high corner at the back. She ran the stovepipe up through a natural fissure in the limestone, because she had looked for a fissure before she decided where to dig the cellar, knowing that the fissure was the thing that made the draft work, and she had been right about where to find it. The total additional cost was 35 cents for 2 extra sections of tin pipe. Ruth came over on the morning of the first fire to see how the installation had gone, and she found Sadie in the cellar with a small child on her hip, a daughter 14 months old named Agnes, who regarded the underground room with the grave and total attention that very small children bring to new spaces. Sadie had the fire going, the draft clean and steady, the smoke rising without hesitation through the pipe above. Ruth pressed her palm against the stone wall of the storage end. Cool and even, the deep, indifferent cool of the earth at depth, exactly what it had always been. Sadie watched her. Then Sadie reached out and placed Agnes's small hand against the stone beside Ruth's hand. Agnes pulled her hand back immediately, surprised by the cold, and looked at her mother with the expression of someone who has been given information they are not sure what to do with. Sadie said to her daughter, "Feel that. The earth does not care what month it is up there. Down here it is always the same. Your job is to figure out what that means." Ruth stood with her hand against the stone for a moment longer. The cellar was new, and it smelled of fresh-cut oak and turned earth, and the first smoke of a first fire, the smell of a place that has just become what it was always going to be. Behind her, the morning fire was building steadily in the stove, the warmth beginning to move through the back of the cellar, the 2 zones establishing themselves the way they always established themselves, the warm end for cooking and the cool end for keeping the earth, doing what it had always been willing to do when someone was willing to ask it properly. She thought about Harlan Voss. She thought about the July morning in Carroll County in 1874, and the stone wall of her grandfather's cellar, and the cold that moved into her palm, and the words that had taken her 10 years to understand, and then the rest of her life to use. She thought about the first fire she had built in this cellar, in November of 1884, and the $11 on the kitchen table, and the damp and frozen winter that had done its worst and failed to find a purchase. She thought about the beans in February green as July sealed under wax in the lamplight, the color of a garden month surviving underground through the worst of the cold, as if time itself could be preserved if you understood what the earth was willing to hold. She did not say any of this. She did not need to. The stone was saying it. The fire was saying it. The cool, even air of the underground room was saying it in the language it had always spoken, the language of temperature and time, and the simple, reliable properties of earth at depth. She removed her hand from the wall. She told Sadie the bread would rise on the warm counter beside the stove, and to move it to the cool end when the crust set, or it would dry out overnight. She said to check the fissure seal in spring after the frost worked the limestone, because the first winter always moved the stone a little and the clay would need repacking. She said the sauerkraut crock wanted to sit on the second shelf from the floor in the coldest section, not the top shelf, because the floor held a degree or 2 cooler than the walls at that height. And the slower the fermentation, the cleaner the flavor. Sadie listened with the same serious attention she had brought to everything since she was 12 years old. Not writing it down this time because she did not need to write it down. The knowledge already in her hands, and her hands already knowing what to do with it. Ruth went back up the slope and along the road to her own farm, and the morning light was coming in flat and golden over the eastern ridge, the way it comes in on clear October mornings in the Ozarks, laying itself across the hillsides and the tree lines in the creek bottom. Without emphasis, simply present the way things are present, when they have always been there and will continue to be. She went down to her own cellar and started her own morning fire, the stove that had been in the hill since November of 1884. The pipe still running clean through the limestone fissure above the stone platform, still doing what it had always done, holding heat through the cooking period and releasing it slowly into the floor while the earth above held the cool steady in the storage end. She put water on for tea and stood in the warm end of the cellar while the fire built. The best kitchen Ruth Mercer ever had cost 35 cents and was invisible from the road. The worst problem she ever solved, she solved by going underground. And the lesson she left behind was not about food or fire or stone, though it was about all of those things. It was about knowing which things the earth will do for you, and knowing what you have to do in return, and having the patience to stand still long enough in the cool and the dark to let the stone tell you what it knows. Her father had tried to tell her this in a root cellar in Carroll County in July of 1874. She had carried it for 10 years before she understood it. She had spent the rest of her life understanding it more. The fire was burning clean. The smoke was rising through the limestone above. The storage end was exactly what it had always been, 47 degrees and steady. The temperature that the earth maintained at depth. Everywhere in the temperate world, indifferent to the season, indifferent to the hardship, indifferent to the certainty of the men who said it could not be done. Down here it was always the same. That was the lesson. That had always been the lesson. Your job is to figure out what it means,